Welcome to Miss Marple Mystery. A funeral, a smile where grief should be, a husband dead, and a secret buried beneath roses. Where are you listening from tonight? Let us know below. The church bells of Mary Mead tolled softly that Thursday afternoon, their solemn rhythm echoing through the crisp air and down the narrow lanes lined with hedgerows and climbing roses. The villagers gathered in subdued clusters outside the small stone church, their voices a blend of whispers and sighs, hats and handkerchiefs fluttering like moths in the cool autumn breeze. They had come to say farewell to Mr. Henry Partridge, a man of strict habits, occasional temper, and an unfortunate tendency to lecture on moral decline. His sudden death after supper 3 nights ago had startled no one more than his wife. Or so everyone assumed. Mrs. Clara Partridge stood at the edge of the grave, wearing a veil of thin black lace and an expression of serene composure. Her gloved hands were clasped loosely before her. Her posture was straight, calm, almost peaceful. But what truly unsettled the mourners wasn't her composure, it was the faint, unmistakable curve of her lips. A smile, fleeting and delicate, yet undeniably present, as the coffin was lowered into the earth. Miss Jane Marple, seated quietly near the back, noticed it at once. Her blue eyes, sharp and thoughtful beneath the brim of her hat, caught that smile as surely as a bird catches a glimmer of movement in the hedgerows. To most, it would seem a trick of the light, a nervous reaction, or even the effect of grief. But Miss Marple knew that grief seldom produced such expressions. "Poor soul," murmured Mrs. Price Ridley beside her, shaking her head in sympathy tinged with curiosity. "To lose one's husband so suddenly, and yet she seems so very calm, doesn't she?" "Calmness," Miss Marple replied gently, "is often more revealing than tears, my dear, especially when it comes at the wrong moment." Burial. The villagers drifted toward the churchyard gate, the hum of conversation rising. Mr. Partridge had been found dead in his study, apparently from heart failure, though some whispered about poison in his evening brandy. The doctor, a man of few suspicions and many golf appointments, had declared it a natural passing. Still, stories had a way of sprouting like weeds in Mary Mead. "She smiled," whispered young Molly Simmons, the postmistress's daughter, to her friend. "I saw it clear as anything, when the coffin went down." "Hush!" the other girl gasped. "That's wicked talk." But wicked or not, the talk would spread. It always did. By supper time, the smile of Mrs. Partridge was the most discussed topic in the village, at the grocer's, at the vicarage, and even at the Blue Boar Inn, where the landlord declared it a sure sign of a woman done with her troubles. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked home along the lane, her knitting bag swinging lightly at her side. She was not one to jump to conclusions, but certain patterns, once glimpsed, lingered in her mind. A smiling widow, a sudden death, a reputation for temper, and a village eager to talk. These were threads that might yet weave into something darker. As she paused to admire the last blooms of autumn in her garden, she thought again of Mrs. Partridge's eyes, clear, bright, and utterly untroubled. Grief might hide itself, yes. But peace? Peace did not arrive so soon after death, unless death itself had been a liberation. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself, plucking a withered leaf from her rose bush. "I do hope," she murmured, "that dear Mrs. Partridge hasn't done anything foolish." The wind stirred the ivy on the churchyard wall in the distance, carrying with it the faint sound of someone laughing, a sharp, nervous laugh that didn't quite belong to mourning. And though Mary Mead looked as tranquil as ever, Miss Marple knew, in her bones, that the village's peace had only just been disturbed. The afternoon settled into a brittle quiet after the funeral, when doors closed softly and kettles began to sing. Miss Marple, having set her teapot to warm, received a timid knock from Molly Simmons. Molly said she came to return a cardigan pattern, but the paper in her handbag was village news in disguise. Miss Marple invited her in. With tea and seed cake, Molly confessed she had seen the smile and, more than that, Mrs. Partridge speaking earnestly with Mr. Lionel Drake the evening before the funeral. Drake, a spruce auctioneer, had been cataloguing Partridge House for an insurance renewal. Molly carried a telegram and waited in the hall. Through the beveled glass she glimpsed Mrs. Partridge leaning close while Mr. Drake folded a paper into his pocket. "It sounded like a price," Molly said. "What for?" "I couldn't tell." Miss Marple listened, then asked whether Molly had noticed anything peculiar on the night of Mr. Partridge's death. "Only that the study window stood open despite the chill," Molly said, "and that the decanter on the tray was not the usual one. Rounder," she added, "like the vicar's Christmas sherry." Miss Marple assured her that noticing is never a sin in a village, only a duty. The girl left comforted. Miss Marple set on her hat and walked toward Partridge House. At the gate, she met Inspector Graves, a man of moderate imagination. He touched his hat and repeated the doctor's verdict, heart failure, and suggested that talk would fade. Miss Marple agreed so warmly his guard relaxed. She wondered aloud whether he had looked at the tea things. "Routine," she said, "deserves attention when interrupted." He promised to inquire promptly. Partridge House received visitors like a cat. Mrs. Partridge received Miss Marple among chrysanthemums. She was composed and grateful, gentle about Henry's virtues, his precision, his dislike of draughts. It was odd, Miss Marple ventured, that the study window had been left open. Mrs. Partridge's hands were very still. She believed the maid had opened it earlier. Henry's cigars were strong. The maid, Ada Pierce, brought tea, rattling the spoons. A pale girl with cautious shoulders, she glanced at her mistress before each answer. "Yes," she prepared Mr. Partridge's tea at 9:30. No, she hadn't entered the study again until the mistress rang at 10:10. There had been a strange smell, perhaps from the fire. Not gas, a sweetish scent. Miss Marple said fires often gave odd perfumes when green wood was used. Ada looked relieved and added that Mr. Partridge had been fuming about Mr. Drake's inventory, threatening to cancel the policy. Before leaving, Miss Marple praised the chrysanthemums and asked whether Mrs. Partridge had grown them. The widow's smile returned small and precise as she said the blooms were Henry's pride, though he never permitted her to cut them. He disliked disorder, she said. He disliked many things. Outside, Miss Marple paused by the study window, noting polish on the sill and a faint scent candied, faintly medicinal as if a tonic had been heated. She folded the impression away. Across the lane, Mr. Drake emerged from the Blue Boar. He bowed. "Trifling matters of valuation," he said. "The Partridge collection is better than its owner supposed." His eyes measured the house. On her way home, Miss Marple called at the vicarage. Griselda supplied gossip. There had been a quarrel last month between Henry and his nephew, Peter Lay, over an advance. Peter had stormed out, swearing he would sell the silver. Also, Mrs. Partridge had resumed piano lessons with Mr. Felix Arden, the new organist, handsome and unfortunate. "Nothing in it, of course," Griselda said, "but the village prefers poetry to facts." The vicar coughed. Miss Marple was counting, silently, how many people might profit by liberty. When she reached her gate, she turned the small facts as one turns bulbs before planting. An open window in chill weather, a round decanter, a sweetish scent, a smiling widow, an auctioneer with papers, a nephew in need, an organist with eloquent hands. They did not yet make a pattern, but they promised one. She set the kettle to sing and on a clean page wrote, "Without malice. Peace seldom smiles uninvited." Morning light revealed Mary Mead at its most deceptive peaceful lanes, milk carts rattling. Nothing amiss but for the invisible ripple that follows a death too quickly accepted. Miss Marple sat by her breakfast window, knitting and thinking. The partridge that strutted on the lawn so confident, so unaware, reminded her faintly of the late Mr. Partridge. It was curious how nature so often repeated its patterns, even in personalities. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Graves, who had taken her suggestion about the tea things seriously. He looked mildly embarrassed to find her, already expecting him. "You were right, Miss Marple," he said, setting his hat on the table. "Routine deserves attention. The decanter in the study, there was residue of prussic acid. The coroner's testing confirms it. Henry Partridge didn't die of heart failure. He was poisoned." Miss Marple nodded slowly, as if she'd only just remembered where she had heard the word before. "And how extraordinary," she said softly. "That prussic acid smells faintly of almonds. That would explain what poor Ada noticed the sweetness." Graves sighed. "The wife's the obvious one, naturally. She prepared his brandy that evening. But she seems a sensible woman, steady nerves, good reputation. The nephew was away in London. The organist, well, there's gossip, but nothing you'd hang a charge on. And that Drake fellow says he was at the inn most of the night, drinking with the surveyor. I'll be checking it." Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward the clock. "There is something about sense and nerves, Inspector. One can appear very calm when the storm is of one's own making." Graves gave a half smile, half sigh, and left her to her knitting. Later that morning, Miss Marple walked down to the greengrocer's, where conversations ripened as quickly as fruit. Mrs. Price Ridley and Miss Hartnell were already deep in speculation. Partridge's composure, the quarrel between husband and nephew, and, inevitably, the possibility of another man. The organist's name flitted between them like a wasp. Miss Marple's contribution was mild and perfectly judged. "It's curious," she said, "how kindness and cruelty can sometimes look so alike in marriage. I remember a couple in Eastbourne. He was always ill, and she nursed him devotedly, but rather as one tends a garden one dislikes. Every trimming, every neatness, made him smaller until one day he simply stopped." Her companions stared, suitably chilled. Miss Marple bought her apples and moved on, leaving behind her a storm of fresh whispers. That afternoon, she found herself walking past the church. The organ played faintly. Felix Arden, tall and serious, was rehearsing. She slipped inside quietly and listened. His face was pale, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. When he finished, she said softly, "You play beautifully, Mr. Arden. There's tenderness in it." He started, flushing. "Miss Marple, I didn't see you. Forgive me. I haven't been myself since Mrs. Partridge's bereavement," she said gently. His lips pressed into a line. "She's been kind to me. I shouldn't have let gossip touch her. Henry was not an easy man." "No, I imagine not. And yet," she smiled. He turned sharply. "You noticed?" His voice cracked. "I thought I imagined it. I suppose I wanted to. She said something that night after I left their house. Freedom isn't a sin, if it's paid for, honestly. I didn't understand then." Miss Marple regarded him with quiet sympathy. "And you didn't go back?" "No. I went straight home. I swear it." His hands trembled on the keyboard. "She didn't do it, Miss Marple. She couldn't have." "Perhaps not," said Miss Marple, "but freedom, you see, is sometimes prepared by others. The question is, who wanted it most?" Outside, the sky had darkened, promising rain. Miss Marple walked back slowly, her mind ticking like a clock wound too tightly. The smiling widow, the poisoned brandy, the open window that might have let out not just air, but the scent of guilt. Someone else had touched that glass. She was certain someone who understood how love and resentment can share the same heartbeat. By the time she reached her gate, the first drops were falling. She stood still, feeling the damp chill settle on her shawl, and murmured to herself, "There's a pattern forming, one of delicate threads and dangerous hands, and someone, somewhere, has woven it far too neatly to be innocent." Rain fell steadily through the night, turning the cobblestone lanes of Merrymead slick and glistening by morning. Miss Marple awoke early, as was her custom, and found her thoughts still circling around the Partridge affair like moths drawn to a single, unyielding flame. She had lain awake half the night, reviewing every small incident, Molly's observation about the round decanter, Ada's remark about the sweet scent, the open window, the curious calm of the widow, and the haunted expression of young Mr. Arden. Each detail alone was harmless, yet together they suggested intention carefully veiled in politeness. The next day brought another visit, Inspector Graves again, looking more troubled than before. "We've confirmed the poison came from the chemist's shop in Market Belling, a bottle bought a week ago. Name signed as Henry Partridge himself. Only the signature's shaky, too shaky. The chemist thought it odd but didn't question it. Said the lady with him insisted it was for killing wasps in the greenhouse." Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting. "A lady, Inspector?" "Mrs. Partridge, by all accounts," he said grimly, "though the chemist admits he can't be certain. Veil, gloves, soft voice. Still seems likely. She had every opportunity, and the will gives her the house and income outright. Motive, means, and chance. Textbook." Miss Marple looked thoughtfully into the fire. "Textbooks, Inspector, are rather poor guides to human behavior. They never account for kindness or vanity, and vanity, I find, can be deadlier than spite." He frowned. "You think she didn't do it?" "I think she may have had help, or at least confidence that help would come." When he had gone, Miss Marple sat motionless, her knitting idle in her lap. The thought that had been slowly forming now took clearer shape. She rose, took her umbrella, and set off toward the post office under the drizzle. Molly Simmons looked up in surprise when the doorbell jingled. "Molly, my dear," Miss Marple said warmly, "you mentioned seeing Mr. Drake with Mrs. Partridge the day before the funeral. Did he happen to carry any kind of case or parcel?" Molly frowned, searching her memory. "Yes. Now that you say so, he did. A small wooden box, polished like mahogany. He kept it close, like it was valuable." "Interesting," murmured Miss Marple. "And he placed it where? In his car boot, I think." "Mrs. Partridge gave him a paper just before. I thought it was an invoice or something." Miss Marple thanked her, left a few coins for stamps she didn't need, and walked straight to the Blue Boar. Inside, Lionel Drake sat by the fire with his customary confidence, scanning the local paper. When he saw her, his smile was smooth but not kind. "Miss Marple, always a pleasure. Looking for gossip or tea?" "Oh, neither," she said mildly, "though I confess to curiosity. I've heard you were assisting poor Mrs. Partridge with some valuations. Such a comfort to a grieving widow, I'm sure." He raised an eyebrow. "Professional service, nothing more. Henry Partridge was a difficult client, but thorough. His cataloguing was obsessive. And yet," Miss Marple mused, "he seemed to distrust everyone. Odd. Don't you think that his papers should be handled so swiftly after his death?" Drake's fingers drummed once on the table before he smiled again. "Efficiency, Miss Marple. The world runs on it." "Indeed. And yet sometimes efficiency hides anxiety. I suppose if one had acquired something by questionable means, one might wish to finish one's affairs quickly, before questions arose." He laughed, but his eyes flickered. "You've quite the imagination." "Oh, I dare say," she said cheerfully, rising. "One learns much by keeping one's eyes open in a village. Do be careful, Mr. Drake. People have such a talent for remembering faces, even veiled ones." Left him watching her go, his newspaper forgotten. That evening, Miss Marple sat alone by her fire again, the rain now a soft whisper on the windows. She thought of Mrs. Partridge, of the smile at the funeral, of Drake's restless eyes, and of a forged signature on a chemist's ledger. It seemed to her that the late Mr. Partridge had not been the only one deceived. Someone else had thought themselves terribly clever, too sure of their control. But deceit, Miss Marple knew, had a way of slipping through even the finest of nets. She poured herself a cup of tea, and with a faint sigh said aloud, "It's never the poison that shocks me, only the hand that thought it invisible." The rain cleared by morning, leaving a thin mist clinging to the village like breath on glass. Mary Mead seemed calm again, but the quiet carried an uneasy undercurrent. The news had spread. Henry Partridge had been poisoned. By breakfast, every parlour in the village hummed with speculation. Mrs. Partridge remained behind closed curtains, receiving no one. Mr. Drake had driven to the nearby town on business, and the organist, poor Mr. Arden, had not been seen since the previous evening. Miss Marple, however, spent her morning not in gossip but in her garden, pruning her roses with deliberate care. She found that physical stillness often helped the mind see what hurried thought might miss. At 11:30, Ada Pierce appeared, pale and fidgeting. "Miss Marple, I didn't know where else to go. I've not slept a wink since they said Mr. Partridge was poisoned." She wrung her hands in her apron. "They'll be blaming the mistress, I know it. But she didn't, she couldn't. She wasn't even near his glass after supper." Miss Marple offered her a chair and a cup of tea. "Then who was, my dear?" Ada hesitated. "Mr. Drake came that evening, just before supper. Said it was about the papers the master signed. He stayed half an hour, maybe more. I was in the hall, dusting when he left. I saw him give Mrs. Partridge a small box mahogany, polished like something fine, and she looked frightened. She said nothing to the master, not that I heard. But when I cleared the supper tray later, that same box was gone from the bureau." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-air. "And you didn't mention this before?" "I thought it was business, nothing wrong. But now," she faltered, eyes filling. The way she looked, Miss Marple, like she'd seen her freedom and her ruin both at once. Miss Marple's gaze softened. "You've done right to tell me, Ada. Truth has a way of hiding behind silence, but it can't stay there forever." When Ada had gone, Miss Marple sat very still. Her mind arranged the picture as if placing pieces of lace upon a table. Mr. Drake's polished box, the chemist's forged signature, Mrs. Partridge's calm, and that smile, the faint, triumphant curve, when the coffin had descended. There was purpose there. But whose? In the afternoon, Miss Marple took her customary walk toward the vicarage. The air smelled of damp earth and late roses. At the gate, she met young Peter Lee, the nephew, looking gaunt and anxious. He greeted her politely but with an air of suppressed irritation. "You've heard, no doubt," he said tersely, "about my uncle's death being, well, not natural." "Indeed," said Miss Marple mildly. "A dreadful business. You must be quite distressed." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Distressed? Yes, but not surprised. My uncle was a tyrant, cruel to my aunt, stingy with me, and smug about it all. But I didn't kill him, if that's what you're thinking." "Oh, I never think such things without cause," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "But I do wonder you quarrelled over money, did you not?" "Over my own inheritance," he snapped. "He promised to help me start a business, then withdrew the offer to teach me responsibility. I suppose he's learned his final lesson now." His face hardened. Then he caught himself and muttered an apology. "I was in London that night. Ask anyone at the boarding house." "Thank you, my dear," she said kindly. "And if I may give you a bit of advice, when a person speaks too sharply of justice, it sometimes sounds like guilt." She left him reddening by the gate and walked slowly home. That evening, as dusk settled over the village, she wrote a short note and sent it by the postmistress to Inspector Graves. "If you wish to see the truth clearly, look not to the glass, but to the paper beside it. There lies the hand that killed." The next morning, Graves appeared again, eyes sharp. "You were right, Miss Marple. We went over the study again. Hidden in the drawer was an unsigned insurance policy, one that would pay out double in the event of accidental poisoning. And guess who witnessed the document? Lionel Drake, Miss Marple said softly. Graves nodded, grimly. He'll be brought in tonight. Seems your polished gentleman may have been polishing more than furniture. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Vanity, Inspector. I told you it was the deadliest motive of all. But even as she said it, a shadow crossed her expression, for she felt the story was not yet finished. The smile at the funeral still lingered in her memory, and smiles, she knew, could hide more than guilt. Sometimes they hid victory. Evening had fallen by the time Inspector Graves arrived at Miss Marple's cottage once more, his face flushed from rain and satisfaction. "We've got him," he announced, shaking off his hat. Drake confessed he forged Partridge's signature on the policy and laced the brandy that night. Claimed it was meant to look like a suicide to frighten the wife into selling the property cheap. He panicked when the old man actually died. Miss Marple poured him tea and listened quietly. "And Mrs. Partridge?" she asked softly. "She's in the clear," Graves said. "A shocked widow, poor soul. Though I'll admit she's taking it rather well. Hardly shed a tear when I told her the man she trusted was a murderer." Miss Marple stirred her tea, watching the swirl of milk settle. "Sometimes tears are a luxury, Inspector. One must first decide who deserves them." He laughed wearily, missing the glint in her eye. "Well, it's all settled, I'd say. Poisoner caught. Motive clear. No loose ends." Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "No loose ends. That's a rare thing indeed. I should very much like to see this insurance document myself, if you can spare the trouble." He promised to bring a copy the next morning, and when he left, Miss Marple sat by the fire long after the kettle cooled. Something was wrong, she felt it as one feels a draught in a closed room. Drake's confession was plausible but untidy. A man like him would commit fraud, yes. But murder? And the scene so precise, so the patient had the marks of a woman's touch. Not emotional, but deliberate. The next morning, she received a visit before breakfast. Mrs. Partridge, dressed impeccably in black, entered with the poise of one paying a courtesy call. Her smile was faint but genuine. "My dear Miss Marple," she said, taking the offered seat, "I wish to thank you. The inspector tells me your good sense helped bring the truth to light. Poor Lionel, how foolish men can be when they think themselves clever." Miss Marple's expression was mild, but her mind was watchful. Yes, vanity again. A terrible snare. Though I confess, I sometimes think foolishness seldom walks alone. It tends to hold hands with someone rather more cunning. Mrs. Partridge's eyes flickered, just briefly. Then she smiled again. How true. Still, justice has been done. My husband can rest in peace. And you, Miss Marple said gently, are free. The widow met her gaze evenly. Free, yes. A strange word, isn't it? So easily spoken, so dearly bought. She rose to leave, but Miss Marple's voice stopped her. "Before you go, my dear, one small question. That mahogany box, Mr. Drake brought, the one Ada mentioned. Whatever became of it?" Mrs. Partridge paused at the door. "It was empty, I believe. Just a trinket he'd promised Henry. I burned it in the fire after the police came. Sentimental clutter." "A pity," said Miss Marple softly. "I do so dislike the burning of evidence. Oh, I mean, clutter, of course." Mrs. Partridge's laugh was low and musical. "You are a very shrewd woman, Miss Marple. But I assure you, all evidence was accounted for. When she was gone, the cottage seemed colder." Miss Marple looked out at the churchyard beyond her window. The truth, she thought, was like a flower pressed between pages. It faded but never vanished. She suspected Mrs. Partridge's smile at the funeral had not been one of grief restrained, but of victory obtained. Drake had played his part, but he had been a pawn, not the hand that moved him. By afternoon, Inspector Graves returned, as promised, with a copy of the insurance policy. Miss Marple examined it carefully. "Curious," she murmured. "Drake witnessed it, yes. But note the ink blot near the signature? That hand trembled from fear, not forgery. Henry Partridge signed this himself, most unwillingly, I think." Graves frowned. "You mean she made him?" Miss Marple's knitting resumed, calm and steady. "I mean, my dear Inspector, that Henry Partridge was murdered twice, once by poison, once by pride. She knew his vanity would demand he sign, even if coerced. And once he had, she only had to wait. Drake's ambition made him the perfect scapegoat." Graves sat heavily, realization dawning like slow thunder. "Good Lord! But there's no proof." "No," said Miss Marple gently. "There never is, when the cleverest criminal commits the crime through another's hand. But if you ever doubt, remember that smile at the funeral. Guilt hides, triumph doesn't." Outside, the bells of Mary Mead began to toll again, slow and heavy, while Miss Marple, serene and grave, poured more tea and whispered to herself, "Justice seldom needs applause, but it does so love irony." The following day broke clear and bright, but Mary Mead's sunshine carried little warmth. News of Lionel Drake's arrest spread like smoke, curling into every parlor and drawing room until no teacup in the village was lifted without a whisper of speculation. Miss Marple, however, knew gossip was often a substitute for thought, and she preferred the latter. She spent her morning walking slowly toward Partridge House, where the shutters had been thrown open again. The garden was tidy, the chrysanthemums trimmed, and Mrs. Partridge herself was on the terrace, pouring tea as though nothing extraordinary had ever occurred. "My dear Miss Marple," she greeted lightly. "How good of you to visit. You see, life insists on continuing, doesn't it? The neighbors think it morbid, but I detest drawn curtains. They make death seem so very permanent." Miss Marple smiled, accepting a cup. "You always did have a practical nature, Mrs. Partridge, and how fortunate that the dreadful business is behind you at last." "Quite behind me," said Mrs. Partridge, her voice calm as the china she held. "Lionel was reckless, poor man. He loved himself too much. I imagine he thought me equally foolish." "Men often do," said Miss Marple gently. "Though I wonder, between the two of you, who truly underestimated whom." A delicate silence followed. Only the bees in the rose hedge filled it. Mrs. Partridge stirred her tea, the spoon clinking softly. "You think me cruel," she said suddenly, her voice low. "But you must understand Henry's tyranny was not the sort that bruises the skin. It bruises the spirit. He catalogued every word I spoke, every penny I spent, every hour I breathed. I was expected to be an exhibit in his collection of proprieties." Miss Marple nodded. "I dare say you learned to hide yourself quite well under such conditions." "Hide?" A faint smile touched Mrs. Partridge's lips. "Oh, I didn't hide, Miss Marple. I endured. And when endurance became intolerable, I chose freedom. Some women pray for deliverance. I planned for it." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression mild. "A dangerous confession, my dear." "It isn't a confession," Mrs. Partridge said, almost serenely. "It's a truth wrapped in discretion. And you, of all people, understand the difference." Before Miss Marple could reply, a sudden commotion rose from the garden path. Inspector Graves appeared, looking uneasy. "I beg your pardon, ladies. Miss Marple, Mrs. Partridge, something's come up." He hesitated, glancing at the widow. "It seems Drake's dead, found this morning in his cell. Cyanide hidden in a matchbox. Took it during the night." For the briefest moment, Mrs. Partridge's hand trembled, the teacup rattling in its saucer. Then she set it down carefully. "How dreadful, though I suppose poetic justice appeals to some men. They always want the last word." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on her face. "Yes," she said softly, "and sometimes they get it even when it isn't theirs to claim." Graves nodded stiffly and withdrew, leaving behind the faint scent of damp uniform and unease. Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting fingers idle in her lap. "I wonder," she murmured after a moment, "how Mr. Drake managed to obtain poison while under guard. It's such a troublesome substance to find in a police cell." Mrs. Partridge looked toward the garden, her tone airy. He was a resourceful man. Perhaps he planned for every contingency. "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but firm. "Or perhaps someone else planned it for him. It takes a clever mind to close every door behind a scapegoat." Their eyes met then, two women, one who killed quietly, the other who understood without needing proof. Miss Marple rose, adjusting her shawl. "I shall leave you to your tea, my dear. But if I may offer advice, freedom gained through another's death tends to wither, like a rose cut too soon, beautiful but gone before its time." Mrs. Partridge's composure faltered for a breath, then steadied. "Perhaps, Miss Marple, but even wilted flowers are better than those forever caged in glass." Miss Marple inclined her head gently and walked back toward the lane. The air carried the faint perfume of chrysanthemums. Henry Partridge's pride, now tended by the woman who had outlived him, outwitted her lover and silenced her accomplice. Miss Marple did not smile, but there was a sadness in her eyes that went deeper than pity. As she reached her gate, she paused, looking back once at the house gleaming in the sun. "No justice without irony," she whispered, "and no peace for those who mistake silence for safety." The gate clicked softly behind her, and the village carried on, unaware that its quietest resident had again seen straight into the darkest corner of human nature. The days that followed Drake's sudden death were curiously hushed in Merry Mead. The villagers, who had once fed on scandal with cheerful appetite, now spoke of it in subdued tones, as though the air itself had grown sensitive to gossip. Mrs. Partridge remained within her home, accepting the occasional condolence visit, while Inspector Graves busied himself writing reports that seemed to trouble him more the longer he wrote. Miss Marple, meanwhile, continued her quiet routine, though anyone who knew her well would have noticed a faint tightening in her expression, a look that always meant her mind was busily weaving its threads into something unseen. One afternoon, while arranging flowers in her sitting room, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Felix Arden, the organist, stood at her door looking pale and anxious, his hat clutched in both hands. "Forgive the intrusion, Miss Marple," he began, his voice unsteady. "I don't know who else to turn to. It's about Mrs. Partridge." Miss Marple motioned for him to sit, her curiosity masked by gentleness. "Yes, Mr. Arden. She came to see me this morning," he said, his words quick and breathless. "Asked me to play at her husband's memorial next Sunday. She was perfectly calm, too calm. But then she said something strange. She said, 'There's no sin in silence if the world won't listen to the truth.' It frightened me, Miss Marple, as though she were warning me or herself." Miss Marple regarded him quietly. "Did she mention Mr. Drake?" A shadow crossed his face, only that she pitied him. "But she asked whether the police might ever reopen the case if they found new evidence. When I said it was possible, she smiled and said, 'Then I must make sure nothing remains to find.' That's what brought me here." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I see. She's not finished with the matter. Thank you, Mr. Arden. You've been most helpful." After he left, she sat for a long while in silence, fingers lightly tapping the arm of her chair. There was one thread still loose, one piece of the pattern she could not quite settle. Drake's suicide had come too conveniently. The cyanide, Graves had said, was found in a matchbox under his pillow. But why would a man under arrest for forgery, not murder, carry poison to the gallows? It was too neat, too final, and Mrs. Partridge's question about new evidence rang in her mind like the toll of a warning bell. That evening, as twilight crept across the village, Miss Marple walked to the vicarage, where Inspector Graves was having a word with the vicar about the coming memorial. He looked up, surprised to see her. "Evening, Miss Marple. I hope you're not here to tell me Drake's ghost has started haunting the lane." She smiled faintly. "Nothing so dramatic, Inspector. But I have been thinking about the matchbox." "Who found it?" He frowned. "The constable on night duty. Routine check before dawn. Poor fellow's still shaken." "And the cell was locked?" "Tightly. No visitors. Meals passed through the hatch." "Then perhaps," she said softly, "the matchbox was never brought in by Drake at all." Graves blinked. "You mean planted? By someone with a strong reason to ensure he could never retract his confession." "You see, confessions can be made in fear, but fear fades when the lights go out. If Drake had woken one morning with doubts, he might have decided to tell the truth. A dead man, however, tells nothing." Graves rubbed his chin, uneasy. "But who?" "Who indeed?" Miss Marple murmured. "Someone with access to his belongings after arrest. Someone clever enough to feign sympathy and suggest guilt was nobler than disgrace. Someone who visited him before his suicide, perhaps with the comfort of forgiveness." The inspector stared at her, then let out a low whistle. "You think she gave it to him? You think the widow finished what she started?" Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap. "I think, Mrs. Partridge has always known how to make others do her bidding. Inspector first her husband, then her lover, and finally her scapegoat. She need not raise her voice, only offer the right word to the right man at the right moment. The poison, I suspect, was merely the punctuation to her freedom." Graves looked grim. "I can't arrest a woman on suspicion of cleverness." "No," Miss Marple said gently, "but you can ensure the next man she charms knows the story. Evil, when dressed in refinement, must still be recognized for what it is." Later that night, as Miss Marple sat alone by the hearth, she heard the church clock strike 10. She thought of Mrs. Partridge, sitting in her grand, quiet house, and wondered whether peace truly followed victory or whether silence, like poison, merely delayed its consequence. The flames flickered low, and Miss Marple whispered into the stillness, "Some truths, I fear, never rest in graves, they linger," yet smiling. The next morning dawned with the sort of brightness that deceived the eye into believing the world innocent again. But Miss Marple knew that sunshine often fell hardest upon buried sins. The village stirred back into its usual rhythm, postmen whistling, milk carts rattling, and the faint hum of gossip finding new life around the tragedy's edges. Yet beneath the ordinary murmur, something uneasy lingered, like the aftertaste of bitter medicine. Inspector Graves had called earlier, thanking Miss Marple for her insight. Though his tone was weary, he admitted he could do little more. There was no proof, no confession, only a pattern of events too deliberate to be dismissed as coincidence. "We'll let it rest," he had said, his voice low. "Sometimes the law can't touch what conscience will." Miss Marple had nodded, though privately she wondered if conscience had ever once whispered to Mrs. Partridge. That afternoon, she decided to attend the church, where Felix Arden was rehearsing for the memorial service. The door creaked as she entered, and the strains of an organ prelude floated through the air, melancholy, tremulous, almost pleading. Felix turned, startled, and stopped playing when he saw her. "Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting company." "I do beg your pardon, Mr. Arden," she said kindly, "but music often speaks when people dare not. And your playing, I think, has something rather to say." He hesitated, then sighed. "It's strange, isn't it? The memorial is for a man no one truly mourns. Mrs. Partridge insists it must be beautiful," she said. "Beauty redeems everything." He gave a hollow laugh. "I'm not sure she believes that herself." Miss Marple sat in one of the pews, hands folded neatly. "She does believe it, my dear, only not in the way most people mean. Some souls think beauty lies in control, in arranging life and death to suit one's own composition." Felix looked troubled. "Do you think she—" "I think," Miss Marple interrupted softly, that she has built her freedom upon silence, and silence, like the sea, erodes even the strongest shore if you listen long enough. Their conversation was broken by the sound of the door opening. Mrs. Partridge entered, dressed in pale grey rather than morning black. The colour suited her soft, elegant, untroubled. She smiled when she saw Miss Marple. "How delightful to find you here. I'm just checking on the arrangements." "Felix, dear, I trust the hymn selections are satisfactory." "Yes, Mrs. Partridge," he replied stiffly. She moved closer to Miss Marple. "I hope you will attend the service on Sunday. I should so like to see the village united again. Forgiveness, after all, is the final courtesy." "Forgiveness," Miss Marple murmured, "is a virtue best reserved for the repentant." Mrs. Partridge's expression did not change, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "You think me unrepentant?" "I think," Miss Marple said with gentle finality, "that remorse and satisfaction rarely share the same smile." A silence followed, broken only by the faint ticking of the church clock. Then Mrs. Partridge laughed softly. "You're remarkable, Miss Marple. I wonder if you enjoy seeing through people as much as you pretend not to." "I take no enjoyment in it," Miss Marple replied. "Only understanding, and sometimes understanding is quite dreadful company." Mrs. Partridge studied her for a long moment, then turned away. "You needn't fear for me," she said quietly. "I shall do nothing foolish. My husband lies at peace, Mr. Drake has paid his due, and the world will forget soon enough." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "But forgetting is not the same as peace. One has to live with what one remembers." Mrs. Partridge gave a faint, almost wistful smile. "Then I shall live well, Miss Marple." And with that, she glided out of the church, her footsteps fading like a closing chapter. When she was gone, Felix exhaled shakily. "She frightens me," he admitted. "It's as if she's untouchable now, like nothing matters anymore." Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "Oh, something will matter, sooner or later. You see, Mr. Arden, clever people forget that freedom earned through wickedness has one great flaw: it must be maintained. Lies are such fragile things, they tear with the lightest pull." That evening, Miss Marple walked home under a sky streaked with violet and gold. As she neared her cottage, she saw the postboy approach with a telegram. It was from the solicitor in Market Belling, urgent, regarding the late Henry Partridge's estate. A newly discovered clause, it said, invalidated the insurance in cases of foul play. The fortune Mrs. Partridge thought hers would revert to charity under the church's trustees. Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it slowly. The irony was perfect, almost poetic. For a long time she stood in the lane, listening to the quiet hum of the village settling into evening. Somewhere, a nightingale began to sing. "Yes," she whispered to herself, "the world does have its ways of correcting its balance, just never quite as we expect." And with that quiet satisfaction, she turned toward home, of her heart both heavy and at peace. The morning that followed brought a deceptive serenity to Mary Mead. Dew sparkled on the hedgerows, and the faint fragrance of late roses lingered in the air, yet Miss Marple felt a subtle tension threading through the village, as though the earth itself were aware of the consequences yet to unfold. She walked slowly down the lane, her mind threading together events of the past week, each detail a small stitch in a larger tapestry she had yet to complete. The telegram she had received the previous evening, revealing the invalidation of the insurance policy due to the clause on foul play, had left her quietly amused. Mrs. Partridge's triumph had been spectacular but short-lived, and Miss Marple wondered whether the widow herself fully realized how fragile her position now was. Reaching the church, Miss Marple paused to observe the activity within. Felix Arden was there, adjusting hymnals and pacing the aisle, as though rehearsing not just for the service, but for courage. His face bore the tension of a man who had seen more than he could comfortably admit. And he startled slightly when Miss Marple entered. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said quietly, almost apologetically. "Good morning, Mr. Arden," she replied, seating herself in one of the polished pews. "You look troubled." He ran a hand through his hair. "I am, Miss Marple. I keep thinking about Mrs. Partridge, how she can be so serene after everything. I don't understand it. And now, with this telegram from the solicitor, it seems her freedom, or at least what she thought of as freedom, is slipping away." Arden. Those who have exercised control with precision are the ones most unprepared when control is taken from them. They have relied on circumstance, on fear, on appearances, but when reality intervenes, it is far more unsettling than any ordinary misfortune. Felix shivered, not from the autumn chill, but from unease. "And yet, she smiles," he said, voice low, "even now." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "That smile is her shield, her mask, her weapon. People rarely see what lies behind it until it is too late." She paused, considering. "I think she must be confronted, gently, but decisively. Not to accuse, but to observe. A reaction, even subtle, can reveal much more than words." Felix's eyes widened. "You mean, Mr. Arden, that if one wishes to know the truth about a careful mind, one must watch how it responds when the stakes are unexpectedly altered." By mid-morning, Miss Marple set out for Partridge House. The widow herself answered the door, her composure flawless, her pale grey gown immaculate. "Miss Marple," she said with polite warmth, "what a surprise. Please, do come in." "Thank you," Miss Marple said, stepping inside. She allowed her eyes to drift over the polished floors, the carefully arranged furniture, and the bright chrysanthemums lining the hallway. All of it spoke of control maintained meticulously, of order imposed to shield chaos beneath. "Mrs. Partridge, I hope you will forgive my intrusion, but I wish to discuss your upcoming memorial service and some practical matters." Mrs. Partridge's eyes narrowed imperceptibly, though her smile never faltered. "Of course, practical matters are always welcome. Do sit." Miss Marple followed her into the drawing room. She noticed that the widow had left the mahogany box from Drake's visit nowhere in sight. A detail that, though subtle, did not escape Miss Marple's attention. Pouring herself a cup of tea, Miss Marple began gently. "I received a telegram yesterday from your solicitor. The insurance clause foul play renders the payout invalid. It seems fortune has a way of balancing itself." Mrs. Partridge sipped her tea delicately, as if tasting the words rather than their meaning. "Indeed," she said lightly. "Life is nothing if not full of surprises, Miss Marple. We adapt or we falter. And adaptation is easier when one has anticipated every eventuality." Miss Marple said softly, "I have come because, though your composure is admirable, there are details that can slip past even the most meticulous observer. One must be careful where one leaves traces, lest they be misread." Mrs. Partridge's faint smile deepened slightly. "I understand perfectly. And you, I presume, are one of those observers." Miss Marple inclined her head, letting her knitting rest on her lap. "One observes to understand, not to accuse. But understanding is essential. You must know that even the cleverest arrangements have weak points, small, almost imperceptible, but revealing." The widow's hand hovered over the teacup. "You imply, Miss Marple, that there is more to be uncovered here." "I imply only that a person's true nature often manifests when certainty is removed," said Miss Marple, choosing her words carefully. "Fortune has shifted, and I wonder how one who has relied on fear and on appearances will respond." A silence followed, filled only by the ticking of the grandfather clock. Mrs. Partridge's eyes flicked toward the window, then back to Miss Marple. "You are suggesting a test," she said softly. "Not a test to condemn," said Miss Marple. only a means to observe. I have a theory, Mrs. Partridge, about your role in the events that led to your husband's demise and Mr. Drake's unfortunate end. And yet, theory without observation is fragile. One needs confirmation, subtle, nearly invisible. Mrs. Partridge placed her cup down, her fingers brushing the edge of the saucer. You are clever, Miss Marple. Perhaps more clever than I realized. And what is it that you believe? I believe, Miss Marple said slowly, that your freedom was gained through manipulation, through the clever positioning of others to act in ways you desired. That Mr. Drake was a tool, not a perpetrator. That you orchestrated events quietly, invisibly, leaving only traces for those perceptive enough to notice. The widow's lips pressed together. For the briefest moment, her mask faltered, revealing a glimmer of surprise, or perhaps calculation. Then it returned, perfect as ever, lightly. And if you are correct? Miss Marple leaned forward. Then the final question is simple. What will you do now that your schemes are rendered ineffective? Fortune no longer serves as your instrument. Will you adapt, or will you attempt further manipulation? Mrs. Partridge's gaze swept the room, sharp and measured. Her fingers tapped once against the teacup. I see, she said finally, her voice calm, yet edged with something more. You are suggesting that the real power lies not in circumstance, but in subtlety, observation, and timing. Very well. I accept your challenge, Miss Marple. I will act, cautiously. Miss Marple allowed herself a small nod. Caution is wise, but remember, even the most subtle actions can leave traces visible to someone who knows where to look. The widow rose, glancing at the chrysanthemums lining the window. Then I shall leave them untouched today. We shall see whether your observations extend beyond words, Miss Marple, and perhaps, in time, the village will judge what is proper and what is not. As Miss Marple left Partridge House, she walked slowly down the lane, feeling the weight of the events around her. Each smile, each gesture, each small decision now seemed loaded with meaning. Mrs. Partridge had acted decisively, but Miss Marple knew that the web of human behavior is never fully controlled. There are always missteps, however tiny, that reveal the truth. By late afternoon, Miss Marple returned home, pausing at her garden gate to consider the village from her quiet vantage point. She reflected on every detail. The widow's composure, the subtle tremor of hands, the patterns in which the servants moved, and the faint, lingering sense that betrayed intention. A story of carefully placed moves, of manipulation and concealment, had unfolded before her eyes. Yet the final revelation, the complete picture, remained just out of reach, awaiting a moment when Mrs. Partridge's confidence would overstep itself. Sitting by the fire as dusk deepened into night, Miss Marple arranged her knitting and contemplated the subtle balances of morality and cunning she had witnessed. She knew that the village's apparent tranquility was illusory. Beneath it lay currents of ambition, fear, and desire. And she, with her quiet patience and her understanding of human nature, would wait until the final move was made, until the hand behind the web could be revealed in full, undeniable clarity. The clock chimed softly, and Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts already plotting the delicate psychological tests that might prompt the final confession, or at least the smallest revealing gesture. She understood that in Mary Mead, as in any place, human nature obeys patterns, and those patterns, once studied long enough, cannot hide their consequences. The widow's smile, the dead men, the false confessions, the carefully orchestrated appearances, all of it formed a mosaic of intent. And Miss Marple knew that the moment of revelation would arrive not through brute evidence, nor through chance, but through a simple, perfectly timed observation. A glance, a gesture, a tremor, a pause in a carefully rehearsed smile. The truth, patient and enduring, would emerge. She set her cup down, letting the warmth seep into her hands, and whispered to the empty room, "Soon, all the pieces will speak, and I shall hear them." Outside, the village was quiet. But Miss Marple felt the pulse of anticipation in every shuttered window, every hedgerow, every careful smile. The story was not yet complete, but its final chapters were beginning to write themselves, and she would watch every word as it unfolded.